July 16, 1945. Potsdam, Germany. President Harry Truman is seated at his desk inside the Little White House, a villa nestled in Berlin's bombed-out suburbs. An urgent coded message from Washington has just reached him. The message is brief, yet it carries world-altering implications. Operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet complete, but results seem satisfactory. Truman grasps the meaning behind the code immediately. It signifies that the atomic bomb test in New Mexico has been successful. The United States now controls the most devastating weapon humanity has ever created. A single bomb capable of annihilating an entire city. A weapon that could bring the war with Japan to an end without requiring an invasion. A weapon that transforms everything. However, Truman has kept most of his military leadership in the dark about this weapon. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander who guided Allied forces to victory across Europe, remains completely unaware of its existence. Eisenhower is present here at Potsdam serving as an advisor, yet nobody has provided him with any briefing on the Manhattan Project. He has absolutely no idea that while he's been strategizing conventional military operations, scientists working in the New Mexico desert have been constructing something that renders conventional warfare obsolete. Truman decides the time has come to inform Eisenhower. A few days later, he draws Eisenhower aside for a private discussion. What transpires during that conversation will haunt both men for the remainder of their lives. Because when Truman reveals the existence of the atomic bomb to Eisenhower and seeks his opinion, Eisenhower responds with something Truman doesn't want to hear. Eisenhower advises him against using it. This is the story of that conversation, what was actually said, why it held such significance, and how it exposes the moral chasm between two men who would both eventually become president. It's about the moment when the architect of D-Day attempted to prevent the deployment of a weapon that would claim 200,000 Japanese civilian lives, and it's about why Truman proceeded anyway. Anyway, let's step back to understand how we arrived at this point. The Manhattan Project commenced in 1942. It represented a massive scientific undertaking aimed at constructing an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany could develop one. The project consumed $2 billion and employed more than 130,000 people laboring at classified facilities throughout the United States. It stood as the most zealously guarded secret of World War II. The level of secrecy was extraordinary. Even Vice President Harry Truman remained uninformed about it. When he assumed the presidency on April 12, 1945, following FDR's death, Secretary of War Henry Stimson had to disclose the Manhattan Project to him for the very first time. Truman was stunned. As vice president, he'd been kept entirely in the dark regarding a weapons program that had cost billions of dollars. Military leaders were similarly excluded from the inner circle. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding forces in the Pacific, had no knowledge of it. Admiral Chester Nimitz was equally uninformed, and General Dwight Eisenhower, despite holding the position of Supreme Commander in Europe, was also left completely unaware. Eisenhower had just completed his mission of winning the war in Europe. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Eisenhower had orchestrated the D-Day invasion, the liberation of France, and the ultimate push into Germany. He was arguably the most celebrated and accomplished general anywhere in the world. Yet nobody had informed him that scientists were developing a weapon that could have rendered much of his work unnecessary. In July 1945, Truman, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin convened at Potsdam outside Berlin to negotiate the post-war order. Truman brought Eisenhower along to serve as a military advisor. The primary topic of discussion centered on what to do about Japan. Germany had been defeated, but Japan continued fighting. The question became how to bring the Pacific War to a conclusion. The Pentagon was actively planning Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan itself. The strategy called for landing troops on Kyushu in November 1945, followed by an assault on Honshu in March 1946. Military analysts estimated the operation would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties, along with millions of Japanese casualties. The Battle of Okinawa, which had only recently concluded, had provided everyone with a grim preview of how horrifically bloody an invasion of the Japanese home islands would prove to be. The Japanese had fought essentially to the last man standing. Civilians had taken their own lives rather than accept surrender. But now Truman possessed an alternative. The atomic bomb could potentially compel Japan to surrender without necessitating an invasion. On July 16th, the Trinity test in New Mexico succeeded beyond all expectations. The bomb functioned as designed. It packed the explosive power of 20,000 tons of TNT. It could obliterate an entire city. Truman was excited about this development. This weapon could preserve American lives. It could terminate the war swiftly. It could also transmit a powerful message to Stalin that America possessed capabilities the Soviet Union couldn't match. Truman viewed the atomic bomb as a solution to multiple problems simultaneously, but he desired military counsel. What did his generals think? Should he deploy this weapon against Japanese cities? Was it militarily essential? Secretary of War Henry Stimson briefed Eisenhower on the atomic bomb sometime around July 20th. The precise date remains uncertain, but we know the conversation occurred at Potsdam. Stimson explained the Manhattan Project, described the successful test, and informed Eisenhower that the bomb would likely be employed against Japan within a matter of weeks. Eisenhower's reaction was immediate and decidedly negative. He later recounted the conversation in multiple venues, including his memoirs and various interviews. His accounts remain consistent across all tellings. When Stimson informed him about the bomb, Eisenhower felt deeply depressed by the news. He told Stimson that Japan was already a defeated nation and that deploying the bomb would be unnecessary. A few days afterward, Truman himself spoke directly with Eisenhower about the bomb. The conversation took place at the Little White House in Potsdam. No other witnesses were present, so we possess only Truman's and Eisenhower's accounts of what transpired. Eisenhower later recalled, "I voiced to him my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary, and secondly because I thought that our country should avoid shocking world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives." This was a remarkable statement for Eisenhower to deliver. He was essentially informing the president that using the atomic bomb would be both militarily unnecessary and morally indefensible. Japan was going to surrender regardless. Eisenhower contended that the blockade and conventional bombing campaigns were already working effectively. The Soviet Union's entry into the war would seal Japan's fate definitively. The atomic bomb simply wasn't needed. Eisenhower held multiple reasons for adopting this position. First, as a military professional, he believed the bomb served no military necessity. Japan's military situation had become utterly hopeless. The Japanese Navy lay in ruins. The Air Force had been decimated. The home islands were enduring constant bombing raids. Food supplies were dwindling rapidly. The Soviet Union stood poised to enter the war against Japan. From a purely military perspective, Japan couldn't sustain the fight much longer. Second, Eisenhower worried about what normalizing the use of such a weapon would signify for the future of warfare. If the United States established a precedent for using atomic weapons, what would prevent other nations from developing and deploying them? Eisenhower foresaw that opening this Pandora's box could trigger an arms race and potentially lead to weapons capable of destroying human civilization itself. Third, Eisenhower harbored profound moral concerns. He'd just spent months in Europe witnessing the devastation of war firsthand. He'd seen demolished cities, displaced populations, and mass human suffering. The concept of deliberately obliterating Japanese cities with a single bomb deeply troubled him. Yes, conventional bombing had already laid waste to many Japanese cities, but there was something fundamentally different about a weapon that could extinguish 100,000 lives in a single instant. Eisenhower conveyed these concerns to Truman during their private conversation. He didn't argue forcefully or attempt to aggressively change Truman's mind. That wasn't Eisenhower's style of leadership. He articulated his opinion clearly, yet respectfully. The president had solicited his view, and he offered it honestly. Truman's reaction was decidedly not positive. Eisenhower later indicated that Truman was visibly upset by his opposition. Truman had no desire to hear arguments against deploying the bomb. He'd already reached his decision. He believed using the bomb represented the correct course of action, and he didn't appreciate a general contradicting that judgment. Truman's reasoning diverged significantly from Eisenhower's perspective. Truman believed the bomb would preserve American lives by eliminating the need for an invasion. The Pentagon had projected that invading Japan could result in 500,000 American casualties, possibly more. If the atomic bomb could avert that invasion, then its use was justified. Truman also desperately wanted to end the war quickly. Every single day the war dragged on, more people perished. American sailors were being killed by kamikaze attacks. Prisoners of war were suffering horrifically in Japanese detention camps. Allied bombing raids were killing Japanese civilians continuously. If the atomic bomb could bring all of this to a rapid conclusion, why wouldn't you employ it? There was also the political dimension to consider. Truman had authorized spending $2 billion on the Manhattan Project. If he ended the war without deploying the bomb, and Americans subsequently discovered he'd possessed this weapon but chose not to use it, they would demand to know why their sons had to die when a weapon existed that could have saved them. Truman would face political crucifixion. And then there was the Stalin factor. Truman wanted to demonstrate American power directly to the Soviet Union. The wartime alliance with Stalin was already beginning to fray at the edges. Tensions were escalating over Poland, Germany, and Eastern Europe. Possessing a weapon that the Soviets didn't have gave America significant leverage. Using the atomic bomb would demonstrate to Stalin that America had capabilities far beyond anything the Soviets could match. So when Eisenhower argued against deploying the bomb, Truman proved unreceptive. The president had his reasons, and Eisenhower's moral qualms weren't going to alter his decision. The conversation concluded without any resolution. Eisenhower had articulated his position clearly. Truman had listened, but remained unpersuaded. The decision belonged to the president to make, not to the generals. Eisenhower's role was to provide counsel when requested. He'd fulfilled that obligation. Now Truman would proceed with what he believed was right. On July 26th, the Potsdam Declaration was issued publicly. It demanded Japan's unconditional surrender and warned of prompt and utter destruction if Japan refused compliance. The declaration made no explicit mention of the atomic bomb, but Truman and his advisors understood perfectly what that utter destruction would entail. Japan didn't surrender. The government was deeply split. Some leaders favored accepting the Potsdam Declaration. Others insisted on continuing the fight in hopes of negotiating better surrender terms. The Japanese government couldn't reach a unified decision. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber called Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The bomb killed approximately 70,000 people instantly, with tens of thousands more dying from radiation poisoning in the following months. The city was obliterated. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing approximately 40,000 people instantly. That same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched an invasion of Manchuria. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. Eisenhower learned about Hiroshima while still stationed in Europe. His reaction was anything but celebratory. He felt vindicated in his earlier concerns, but derived no satisfaction from being proven right. He remained convinced the bomb had been unnecessary and that Japan would have surrendered anyway, particularly once the Soviets entered the conflict. Years later, Eisenhower would speak publicly about his opposition to using the atomic bomb. In a 1963 interview with Newsweek, he stated that the Japanese were ready to surrender, and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. He maintained this consistent position for the remainder of his life. Truman, conversely, never expressed a moment of regret. He believed he'd made the correct decision. He maintained that the atomic bomb saved countless lives by rendering an invasion unnecessary. When critics questioned the decision, Truman defended it vigorously. He never wavered publicly in his conviction that using the bomb was justified. The disagreement between Truman and Eisenhower over the atomic bomb reveals fundamental differences in their worldviews. Truman was a pragmatist at heart. He made decisions based on tangible outcomes. If using the bomb saved American lives, it was the right choice regardless of any moral complications. Eisenhower was more deeply troubled by the moral dimensions of the decision. He worried about establishing dangerous precedents, about how normalizing such weapons would affect the future of warfare, about the human cost even when inflicted upon enemy civilians. He believed certain actions shouldn't be taken, even if they might prove militarily effective. Neither man was simply right or simply wrong. The decision to use the atomic bomb remains one of the most hotly contested controversies in American history. Historians continue debating whether it was truly necessary, whether Japan stood on the verge of surrender anyway, whether alternative approaches weren't fully explored. What's indisputable is that when Truman solicited Eisenhower's opinion, Eisenhower provided it honestly. He stated that using the bomb was unnecessary and ill-advised. He expressed deep concern about the moral implications and the precedent it would establish. He spoke from both his conscience and his military judgment. Truman listened attentively, but disagreed fundamentally. He made the decision to deploy the bomb, and he never regretted it. The war ended. American servicemen returned home. Japan surrendered without requiring an invasion. From Truman's perspective, the ends had justified the means. But Eisenhower's words lingered with both men. Years later, when both had served as president, the memory of that conversation at Potsdam persisted. Truman remembered Eisenhower questioning his judgment. Eisenhower remembered Truman dismissing his concerns. The irony is striking. Eisenhower, who opposed using the atomic bomb, would later expand America's nuclear arsenal to unprecedented levels during his presidency. He relied heavily on nuclear weapons as a deterrent and as a cost-effective defense strategy. He threatened to employ nuclear weapons in Korea and during other international crises. Did this make Eisenhower a hypocrite? Not necessarily. Eisenhower's position remained internally consistent. He opposed deploying atomic weapons against an already defeated enemy that stood on the brink of surrender, but he firmly believed in maintaining nuclear weapons as a deterrent to prevent future wars. He recognized a crucial distinction between using the bomb offensively against civilian populations and possessing it defensively to deter aggression. Truman, meanwhile, had to carry that decision for the rest of his life. He never expressed regret publicly, but those close to him indicated the weight of it affected him profoundly. He'd ordered the deaths of over 100,000 human beings in an instant. That's not something any person carries lightly, regardless of whether they believe it was necessary. The conversation at Potsdam between Truman and Eisenhower represents a pivotal moment in human history. It was the moment when the man who would authorize the atomic bomb's use confronted the man who would oppose it. Two future presidents, one making the most consequential decision of the war, the other issuing a warning against it. What Eisenhower said when Truman revealed the atomic bomb to him was simple yet profound. Don't use it. Japan is already defeated. It's both unnecessary and morally wrong. Truman didn't heed that advice. History will forever debate whether he should have. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to WW2 Gear and hit that like button. Turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into history's most critical moments. Share this video with anyone who appreciates understanding the complex moral decisions of wartime leadership. These stories deserve to be told and discussed. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment and let us know what surprised you most about this conversation. Eisenhower's moral stance? Truman's reasoning? The weight both men carried? We read every comment. This video presents historical events based on documented records, including Eisenhower's memoirs, Truman's papers, Stimson's accounts, and scholarly research on the decision to use the atomic bomb.